I will not accept a movie franchise that I do not deserve. But my God, we all deserve this one. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Shadow Archives. My name is Theo, and today we're going to be talking about Ty West's third title in the X trilogy, MaXXXine. So, MaXXXine is a direct follow up to X. You have Pearl as a prequel, and MaXXXine is kind of like that 80s, 1985 horror aesthetic like Giallo films, and it captures it so well. It is done so well and so well crafted that I can't even begin to fathom to tell you how much I appreciate it. I just want to say before I get started on my positives and my negatives for this movie, how much I appreciate Ty West and this trilogy as a whole. I really, really appreciate everything he's done with this trilogy. It will go down in my books as one of the greatest trilogies in horror ever made. So if you're a fan of Italian horror and giallo films, this will be right up your alley. So I'm sure one of the biggest questions that's going to be asked is, do you need to see X or Pearl in order to understand MaXXXine? And I'm going to be completely honest with you. You probably don't need to see Pearl, but I would honestly suggest you go and see that movie. It is incredible. Rent it, own it, whatever you need to do. But it is an incredible movie that kind of lines up X, and you do need to see X in order to follow up with MaXXXine. Because the events from X kind of take place in MaXXXine, if that makes any sense. Okay, so let's get into some of my positives about this movie. So MaXXXine takes place in 1985, and it's a follow-up to X. And it is a fantastic homage to Giallo horror. The colors, the lighting, the soundtrack, you name it in this movie, and it captures it so perfectly. And like I said, it takes place in 1985, and it's like you get this like dirty, dark side of the 80s that isn't really captured in film too much these days. You get it way back in like the cult 80s movies, the B-side movies. You get a lot of it back then, but this is like, the people doing drugs and the religious side, and people trying to shut down metal music because it was satanic, and rent to own movies, and the 80s soundtrack. That's what we encapsulate in the aesthetic of this film. Another really big positive for me, of course, as you would imagine, is the acting. Mia Goth is fantastic in this movie. I don't think she is as good as she was in Pearl, per se, but I think that she captures the aesthetic and the character of MaXXXine very well. It's like a different MaXXXine than you would have seen in the X movie. In X, she was like this, I'm going to be a star, kind of quiet until the end of the movie type of girl. And in this movie, she's more assertive and more dominant and, a don't fuck with me kind of human. And I really appreciate that from her. Another really, really good standout role for this with me is Kevin Bacon. And I am not the biggest Kevin Bacon fan. Okay, I'm going to be straight up with you. I am not the biggest Kevin Bacon fan. I've liked a few of his movies that are like, from the 80s and a couple from this modern era, but I am not a giant Kevin Bacon fan, but he really stands out in this movie for the character that he plays. He plays basically a PI detective that is trying to hunt down MaXXXine, who's being paid off by somebody who I can't tell you or I'll give away the movie. And he captures the character so well. He's like sadistic and stalkerish, and he's got funny moments, and he's just got like this voice about him that really speaks about like his character. I think he really stands out in this movie a lot. Another thing I really loved about this movie was the kills. The kills for me were a big standout. There's some really good gore in this movie, and there's a lot of like unique kills that haven't really been done in like the last 25 years. And some of those like 80s kills that you would see in like the Freddy movies or some wild B-side movie that kind of just came out randomly but had a wicked kill that you didn't see coming. And that happens a lot in this movie. Kevin Bacon's character, for example, he has a really awesome death sequence in this movie, but it's so well done and so well crafted that it makes you feel like you're in an Italian gangster movie. I also just want to talk about Ty West and this trilogy, because each trilogy is a different aspect for a different style of film, and to be able to create three different styles of movies and nail each one of them to the point where like your audience isn't getting bored, or you're keeping your audience captivated for what's going to happen next. That's a really big feat, especially whenever you think about the three styles that he did. So we started off with X, and that had to do with the Texas Chainsaw slasher killings. And then we went to Pearl, which was supposed to be like an homage to the Wizard of Oz, of all things. And then we go into MaXXXine, which is an Italian Giallo style horror film. So that's three completely different styles of movie making that have been nailed each time throughout this trilogy. I do want to talk about Mia Goth in general, because before this trilogy, I honestly didn't know much about her. And in this trilogy, I think she has developed a character and an acting persona for herself, especially with horror, that has cemented her as, for one, a scream queen, and two, a horror icon for me. I think that these three movies, because she did double duty in X, and then she played Pearl, and now she plays Maxine in the third installment. But I think in all three films, with three different styles of movies that there are, that she has done a very fantastic job of creating each character individually. All right, so let's talk about a couple of the negatives here. So I don't really have a lot to touch base on with the negatives, but there wasn't a lot of tension for this being like a slasher, night stalker, serial killer movie. From like the first scene, I kind of figured out what was going on and kind of predicted about like a quarter of the way through the movie about who the killer was and what was going to be happening at the end. But nonetheless, it doesn't take away from the movie. It just takes away some of the tension and the build up for like the final act. Another negative for me, in complete honesty, is the ending. Not the final ending, but like what leads up in the third act that goes to the ending of the movie. I didn't really care for it, probably because I predicted it from, like I said, the quarter of the way through the movie. I predicted what was going on. So whenever it became a revelation, I was just like, oh, cool. Yeah, I knew that was coming. And it kind of just set it back for me. And then the sequence that entails that goes into the final act isn't the greatest. There is one like massive kill scene that happens on the Hollywood sign area that I thought was really awesome, that I didn't see coming, and that kind of stood out for me. But aside from that, the final act, I just wasn't the greatest fan of. Another negative that might come into play here is that if you don't know like giallo horror and the aspects behind the Italian horror scene from like the 80s era and the 70s era, you probably will not like this movie. There's a giant inspiration behind the giallo films and the Italian horror style in this movie, anywhere ranging from like the soundtrack to the suspense to the murder mystery to the color scheme to the lighting to the acting. Like, it follows giallo horror to a T. So if you aren't a big fan of giallo horror, you probably will not care for this ending. But all in all, I think this trilogy is a massive success for horror. Maxine doesn't destroy it, no matter what you see online. It is a fantastic movie. It is very well crafted. It just has to be like your style of movie. But the trilogy as a whole, for me, will go down in horror history as one of the greatest trilogies ever made in horror. From each film being distinctly different than the last, and each character scheme being completely different than the last, and Mia Goth being able to encapsulate each character that she plays in a different way, from playing the older Pearl in X to playing herself, Maxine in X, to playing Pearl in the prequel, to now playing a more badass Maxine in the 85 standout Maxine movie. I think that Ty West has created a trilogy that will cement him as a horror directing god. But all in all, I definitely think you should give the trilogy a watch. Do not dishonor yourself with not at least giving these movies an opportunity to blow you away in some way, shape, or form. So I will be doing a ranking of the X trilogy in the next couple of days, so be on the lookout for that. I appreciate you guys watching, and until next time, remember to check under your beds and stay safe out there.